Let's talk about proprioception for a minute. We have more than 5 senses, and proprioception is one of our senses. It's a sense that everybody has, and so I want to talk a little bit more about what it is, why it's really important, and then how we can get more proprioceptive input, or parents, how you can help your child to get more proprioceptive input. A few things about proprioception. So what it is generally your body's awareness of where it is in space. It's the ability to be able to sense where your limbs are, where your whole body is, without other cues like your sight, being able to see where it is. And so it's really about your body's position in space, and we can get it usually through either heavy work or deep pressure, because it is registered by the stretch receptors in our muscles and our tendons. The stretch receptors, called golgi-tendon bodies, register our proprioceptive input, and this kind of input is generally grounding. So just like after we do exercises or after we get a massage, we feel our body a bit more than we would typically be aware of it. That's because of proprioceptive input. If you're holding a cup and someone starts to pour liquid into it, you didn't see it or know it because you couldn't hear it, you would know because your muscles would feel that change in the weight, and they would recognize that they need to activate more because of the stretch that increased weight caused when the muscle changed length. So ways that we can get backing up for 1 second, why it's important. So it's really important because of the grounding part, and it really helps us connect our mind to our body. And so proprioception is kind of an underlying scale for all of our other senses. If we aren't aware of where our body is in space, and if we aren't feeling grounded and connected to our body this moment in the space, it's a lot harder for us to be able to process and modulate the other incoming sensory input, and then to be able to filter through auditory input and a lot of visual things around us to know what exactly to attend to. So now we've gone over what proprioception is and why it's important. So how do we get it? If we think about joints, like all of the joints where we can move our body, where our bones come together and there are muscles, there are 2 muscle groups for each joint, or action really, because there's more than 2 muscle groups per joint, but for each action. So for example, for wrist flexion, we have a muscle group on one side that is shortening and activating and pulling the wrist or the hand toward me, and the opposite muscle group on the opposite side is stretching, it's getting longer. So moving our body does give like a tiny bit of proprioceptive input, but you get more input when you're stretching more. So when you are actually doing stretches or exercises, when you're getting a lot of heavy work to your muscles, you're getting more proprioceptive input. There are also a few different ways of exercising, so we'll get into that in a second. Ideally, we would all have a really good sense of precisely where our limbs and our body is in space, how it's positioned, and our bodies would ideally all be able to auto-calculate an appropriate amount of force or trajectory through space as we coordinate our movements. But some of us do have more difficulty with this. A lot of children who have sensory differences have more challenges with this, and it does, of course, make other activities, coordinating our movements, more difficult. So it's really good for us to know more about it, and to recognize there are more than 5 senses. And then for us to also be able to educate our children as much as possible about their own selves and their own bodies, and teaching them these different ways of getting the appropriate inputs. So let's talk a little bit more about how we get proprioceptive input. I like to think of 2 main ways, either active or passive. Now, passive is what we'll get to in a minute, and that's how you help give it to your child more directly and they're not as actively getting it. When possible, I often like to engage children in the active way of getting proprioceptive input, because I think it helps them to get that cause and effect correlation more about, and it also gives them more agency and control over how this input is impacting their bodies. And as much as possible, we like to be active and participating. So for active kinds, there's moving your body and using your muscles. But you have to remember that there's also aerobic exercises. So when you get your heart really pumping, that's going to increase your arousal and your alertness. So if a kid is already dysregulated and all over the place, feeling like their body is, they don't really know where it is in space, then having them do aerobic exercises that are going to just give them more might be counterproductive. Similar to the way sometimes giving a kid rotational input it's not the right answer, and I've seen that done too, just because the kid's seeking vestibular. So we want to find the right balance and the right kind of input to give to help regulate. So there is a time for aerobics, but I prefer isometrics. So an isometric exercise is when we're keeping our muscle the same length, but activating it. So we can think of like move, hold that position, breathe, and then work. So like activate your muscles. And then we can relax again. We might move to a different position, hold that position, make sure we're breathing, and then we can work and do an isometric, just activating our muscles. For kids, just moving and tightening both groups of muscles in some random position isn't going to work. So we like to do things like push on the wall, push, 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 like we're making the room bigger, or you know, lay on your back and put your feet on the wall, push with your feet, use your feet to push the wall bigger or the room bigger. And so isometrics are really great. Yoga incorporates some isometrics and some stretching, so that's another really great activity to get some proprioceptive input. And then there's also, we can do heavy work, so like weight bearing, climbing. If your child was carrying a weighted item like a couple books, a stack of books, or if they were helping you bring in like some groceries from the car, those kinds of activities where they're carrying a little bit of a weighted item for a short distance and then they take a break, that heavy work is also giving them more proprioceptive input. I think that's everything for active that I was going to mention. So let's talk about passive. So a passive proprioceptive warm-up can be achieved in a couple ways as well. There's one common way is a slight increase to all of our work in the form of a weighted vest. A weighted vest is typically 10 to 15% of the person's body weight, and it's worn on a vest, so it's close to their core, and then they can wear it for an amount of time when they're doing, especially like a high focus task, and that little bit of extra weight on their body helps increase their awareness of their body as they're just having to manipulate that extra little bit of weight with their body. Weighted lap pads are similar and work kind of in the same way, but they also just kind of cue to stay seated if it's for a seated activity. They don't work for everyone. Different things work better for different people. Another one that I'm going to mention for passive is a compression garment. So I'm going to stand up today. I am wearing some leggings. So these are a compression garment that are squeezing my legs. And I'm also wearing compression socks that are tight and they give some deep pressure throughout my legs and my feet. I'm also wearing an undershirt under my t-shirt that gives me some compression to my body. And those are some options that work really well for some kids and some individuals. Massage is another form. So massages and squeezies is this last passive way of getting proprioceptive input that we're going to talk about. It's really important that whenever we're putting our hands on someone else, that we're being very respectful with our touch. So of course, we want to make sure we have clean hands, that we are only touching them if they agree to it, and that we're using gentle hands, and of course, touching in appropriate areas. So the hands are one place that we sometimes do hand massages, or we can do squeezies. It's really great to be able to teach your child these things so that over time they can start to give themselves the dots and squeezies, give their arms squeezies or hand hugs to their own hands so that they're able to help regulate themselves better. When children are younger though, and before they've learned how to do it for themselves, it's really helpful if we can give them some massage or sometimes some squeezies. Notice I'm not squeezing so hard that my arm is getting white or what we would call blanching. There's none of the blanching going on. I just there, so you can see I squeezed harder that time and I got blanching. We don't want to squeeze that tightly. We get deep touch, a little deep squeeze, but it's not tight. It should never be painful. If the child is withdrawing, then we wouldn't do it. We would continue to force something that the child doesn't want. Besides hands and arms, squeezing up our arms, we can do shoulders. So your child can cross their arms and squeeze. You can also help them with this and do a gentle squeeze. Some kids really like having their feet and their legs squeezed. This can really help regulate them too. Think about being aware of where your feet and your legs are when you're walking and running and jumping and skipping. It's gonna make it easier. So for some kids that are running and jumping and kicking and all these kinds of things, getting this kind of proprioceptive input can be really helpful. Besides just using our hands though, I do want to mention that, again with touch, we need to be very careful in that we're being respectful, and there are a lot of times children who have sensory differences often have aversion to tactile or like touch, especially light touch, which can be very irritating. So if you think of like a feather or like a tickle, a light touch, it activates those muscles, and it can also, for the tactile receptors, it can be uncomfortable, or I should say it can activate those muscles. It's that kind of input is more activating in that area, and it can be very uncomfortable for some individuals. So rather than light touch, we want to make sure that we are giving firm but comfortable and gentle touch. And even with that, some kids would prefer if we use like a lotion if we're going to massage their hands, because the feeling, maybe they have dry or sensitive skin, so lotion can help provide a more even tactile experience that feels less aversive. So if that's something your child wants, you can use lotion. Be aware of scents with lotion. Sometimes lotion has a smell that's given to it that can also be aversive. So I like to do lotions that have no scent, and the easy sort of lotion go-to is Vaseline. It works basically the same as lotion, but it has less of the additives, and you need very, very little. So you can just put a tiny bit on your fingertips and then massage that in as you're giving the deep pressure to the hands. So especially if you're going to be doing a tactile exploration or engagement activity with our hands, we would definitely want to be focusing on giving extra proprioceptive input to our hands and really warming them up to make sure that they are ready to go.